Good afternoon. My name is David Wilco, and I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing Zuzana Burivalova today. Zuzana received her doctorate at ETH in Zurich with a focus on tropical forest conservation. And in particular, I remember a paper she did, a meta-analysis of the impacts of selective logging, where you don't remove all of the trees, just some of them, but the impact of selective logging on biodiversity that came out in Current Biology in 2014. And I mention that because it was then and remains now, a decade later, I think the best treatment that's been done of this really important subject. And of course, there were a number of other really fine papers that came out of her dissertation. Zuzana was advised by Liang Ko, who is a graduate of our Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So, in a sense, an academic grandchild for Princeton. After receiving her doctorate, she joined us here at Princeton as a postdoc for several years on a fellowship in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy. And the list of things that Zuzana worked on during that time was really quite impressive. She did a wonderful study on forest certification and community-based forest management, examining its efficacy. She also took on a project looking at the social drivers of the trade in wild birds in Southeast Asia, which turns out to be a big threat to a large number of bird species. A nice study on the effectiveness of different conservation strategies in terms of their ability to protect biodiversity. And it was here, I believe, where you began your work on the use of soundscapes to assess the impacts of land use on biodiversity in tropical forests. And that put her as one of the beginning leading researchers on the question of how one might be able to use sound recordings to assess the impacts of various activities on biodiversity in the tropics, where there are so many species that are so poorly known, making so much noise. It was an exciting innovation. Zuzana then accepted a faculty position at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where she's jointly appointed in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology and in the Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies. There, she has created the Sound Forest Lab to continue and expand her work on soundscapes as a means of monitoring tropical forests. She's looked at deforestation patterns outside protected areas and how they can be used to predict whether the protected areas themselves will be harmed by intrusion of logging. She has continued as well to look at the impacts of different types of disturbances, different types of logging on the biodiversity of tropical forests. And in this sort of expansive research agenda, what has always been a constant is that Zuzana's work is imaginative, it's rigorous, and it's highly relevant to the conservation of tropical biodiversity. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Zuzana Burivalova back to Princeton.
Thank you so much, David. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Thank you, David, for the really kind introductions and for inviting me back. And thank you also, Chuck and Keely, for helping organize such a wonderful visit. Thank you all for coming. So when I left Princeton back in 2018, natural climate solutions or nature-based climate solutions were just taking off on the international climate change agenda. So natural climate solutions, and I'll use the term interchangeably today with nature-based climate solutions, are deliberate human actions that protect, restore, and improve the management of forests wetlands, grasslands, oceans, and agricultural lands to mitigate climate change. So back then when I was joining UW and starting my sound forest lab, this was kind of taking off. But a few years later, the vast majority of countries around the world are now including nature-based climate solutions in their individual climate action plans. So all the countries highlighted in green mention nature-based climate solutions in their plans, how they will reduce their emissions. So it's become a really big thing on the international agenda. And today I won't talk about the various controversies. I won't talk whether this is really distracting from us reducing emissions or whether it's a good thing. I will talk about it from biodiversity perspective. And for one really important reasons. The vast majority of nature-based climate solutions concern forests, and particularly tropical forests. And that's because tropical forests store a huge amount of carbon. And there's also often a misperception that this land might not be occupied by people. Therefore, we can just use it for nature-based climate solutions. But this fact that there is a really unprecedented amount of money being mobilized and used by conservation NGOs, governments, and companies to massively scale up nature-based climate solutions, particularly in tropical forests, makes it extremely relevant to me. Because I am interested in tropical forest biodiversity. And together with my lab, the Sound Forest Lab, we're trying to figure out how we can do science that will protect as much biodiversity as possible, but in an equitable way. So that in the future, when deforestation does stop globally, we're left with forests that have a lot of complexity, high biodiversity, and can withstand climate change, rather than some kind of simple carbon farms. And so that's why I care about natural climate solutions, especially when we look at one of these original papers on nature-based climate solutions that rank the different solutions in terms of their climate mitigation potential on the horizontal axis. The top 3 are reforestation, preventing deforestation, and improved forestry. And guess what? These are also one of the top 3 things conservationists have been doing for the last couple of decades to protect biodiversity. And so that's why this is really important, because suddenly we're seeing this really important conservation interventions, right? We reforest habitats to restore habitats for species. We create protected areas so that species can survive in them. We all know that national parks alone are not enough for species, so we also work with forestry companies to make that land between protected areas habitable for species. And because these strategies are kind of taken over by climate-driven agenda being scaled up, it's really important to worry that biodiversity stays on the agenda. Otherwise, we risk ending up with forests that look more like the one on the left, that are actually okay in sequestering carbon. They grow really fast, but are absolutely a disaster for biodiversity. So that's why we want to end up with forests that are more like the ones on the right. And as I've been talking to NGOs and various industries that are implementing nature-based climate solutions, they're not opposed to putting biodiversity on the agenda. They're just always saying, yeah, but we don't know how to measure it. We need a scalable tool to be able to really prove we are protecting biodiversity, just like you have to prove you are sequestering carbon or keeping carbon locked in the land. And that's where I think my lab and my work can really contribute. Because as David mentioned, we've been developing ways to use sounds that animals make, or soundscapes, which are all the sounds in the landscape, to be able to measure biodiversity, especially in low visibility habitats like tropical forests, in a robust, scalable, and relatively cheap way. So the way it works, recording soundscapes, we use devices like the one on the left, which has already been taken over by termites, and we collect huge amounts of data. We can leave this out in the forest for months at a time, and then we have data without having to be in the forest for all those months. So let me play you one sound from Gabon. All right, who is it? What species is it? Owl?
Primate.
Primate. It's getting closer. It was this one. And obviously, for this particular species, for the chimpanzee, we could use methods like camera traps. They're pretty easy to see. It's fun to observe them even. However, this is captured with a camera trap. However, camera traps are not the best for all species. As you can see, you get this limited view into the forest. And that's great for animals that are medium to pretty large, that are on the ground, that will walk in front of the camera, and that are moving relatively slowly, and even better if they go around during the daytime. Whereas acoustic or soundscape recording is good even for animal species that are cryptic, shy, always running away from predators in the rainforest, flying really fast, might be high up in the canopy, so it might be hard to see them. And recording sounds work pretty much as well during the night as during the day. So chimpanzees we could capture with both techniques, but what about all these other species that you can hear? You can probably hear a lot of birds, insects, even maybe some frogs. And so even with a pretty short amount of time, this is a 1-minute soundscape recording, we've been able to capture up to 34 unique sound types per minute, which is crazy amount of data. So our goal then is to use bioacoustics to build a tool with which we could measure biodiversity so that nature-based climate solutions actually are able to truly incorporate biodiversity as one of their goals. And I will give several examples today. First of all, I'll talk about improved forestry in Gabon. Then I'll talk about improved forestry in the broader world. And then I'll talk about a carbon finance initiative in Sierra Leone and Liberia. I'll conclude with a few words on reforestation and some future thoughts. And before I really get started, I want to point out our lab is been coming into University of Wisconsin-Madison from all sorts of corners of the world, and we also work in different parts of the world. And that makes it really important for us to be not only mindful of the various power dynamics that might exist between Wisconsin and the countries where we work, but also take proactive steps to build equitable partnerships. And this is a topic I could talk about for a whole separate talk, but I wanted to just mention 5 main points that we have come up with as a lab as kind of our guiding principles. So first of all, we always want to be a responsible and respectful guest. That might mean learning a bit of the language, learning about the history of the place where we're going, being responsible for ourselves, so training ourselves in field safety so that we're not a burden on our hosts. Working towards equitable partnerships, and together with my colleague Yaya Rayadin from Indonesia, we've written a paper what might help people build these equitable partnerships. Importantly, even if we come with a project, a really exciting nature-based climate solution project in Gabon, it's important to listen to what actual people living in that forest care about. What is their most burning environmental topic, so that next time we can apply for a grant that addresses that issue. And finally, or not finally, after fieldwork is done, that's where I see most equitable partnerships drop off. We come back to our office in beautiful Princeton, and we write our paper, and then it's so easy to forget about our local collaborators. So what we are trying to do in the lab is to stay in touch, whatever it takes, involve local partners in every step of the analysis and interpretation. And finally, it doesn't always work. So learning from mistakes and letting others learn from our mistakes has been really important. And it's helped us not be discouraged if things don't work out every time. Okay, so for our first example, it will be about improved forestry in Gabon. So improved forestry was the number 3 most important nature-based climate solution. And improved forestry really means anything to do with taking trees out of the forest in a less harmful way. So for example, if you are using a paper pad here to write notes with, it might be FSC certified, which means it's certified to be stored sustainably. Yes, David has one. Or we have this nice wooden stand here. Hopefully it's been sourced from a responsible forestry source. And in tropical forests, this mostly concerns selective logging. So just taking few trees here and there, rather than clear cutting, which is still much more common, I would say unfortunately, in the United States and in Europe. And these impacts of selective logging and improved forestry, we have a lot of evidence that it works. I've actually reviewed them a couple of years ago, and I maintain a live database if anyone wants to check it out. We know it works. It leads to less carbon emissions, less habitat damage, but we know less whether it actually works for biodiversity. And that's why we decided to research it, and we did this in Gabon. So what could be the expectations? First of all, we might say, okay, you're causing less damage in the forest. Good. Animals will like it. We know already from my work that David mentioned that higher logging intensities lead to higher biodiversity impact. So if we were able to destroy fewer trees per wooden furniture created, that should lead to lower biodiversity impacts. But at the same time, we also know the way carbon emissions are limited or reduced through improved forestry is actually through slightly higher intensities. Because if you imagine having to cut down one tree in the forest and building one road to get to that tree, the carbon emissions per tree will be higher than if you build that one road but extract 10 trees. So this is a potential trade-off, whether we are maximizing the carbon emissions saved or maximizing benefits to biodiversity. So we looked at this question in Gabon. Gabon is a country that has the Congolese rainforest in it. It's been considered a leader in forest conservation and sustainable forest management. And it overlaps with a lot of bird species, and especially also species that are vulnerable to logging. More than half of Gabon's land is in forestry concessions. It's huge. Forestry is the main thing, apart from oil exploitation, that Gabon does. And so is improved forestry in Gabon connected to better biodiversity outcomes than conventional forestry? And we were able to sample soundscapes for at least 7 days at 114 sites across the whole country in 3 different national parks, 3 conventional logging concessions, and 3 improved forestry concessions. And I just want to say there is absolutely no way whatsoever we could have done this with traditional biodiversity survey techniques. just not possible. Logistically, it was pretty hard as it is to deploy sound recorders at this many sites, but we just couldn't have stayed long enough at each site to observe the biodiversity otherwise. So how did we process the data? I'll talk about two main outcomes. One is called soundscape saturation, which is an index that I developed together with computer scientists from Australia. And it really quantifies how busy or how diverse is the soundscape at any given time. Okay? It's a proxy for species biodiversity. It's not a perfect proxy, but for our case, it's good enough. We can use it to translate this highly complex, extremely rich soundscape data into basically one data point per minute. And we can see with soundscape saturation on the y-axis and the time of the day on the x-axis, what are the peak times, what are the most important times of the day for vocalizing biodiversity. The other thing we extracted was a proxy for hunting pressure. And that we did by processing all of the data through a machine learning algorithm to extract every single gunshot heard. Most hunting happens with gunshots in Gabon. We also are now starting to analyze individual species presence and abundance using manual analysis as well as machine learning algorithms. And that's really fun, but I won't talk about that today because nature-based climate solutions set themselves a target to be no net harm for biodiversity. So we need to know about as many species as we can rather than pick just the chimpanzees. Okay, so let me show you the results. This is the soundscape saturation profile for forests that have been never logged. This is extremely rare to find a forest that has never been logged. Most forests have been logged at least once or even twice. You can see that soundscape saturation, which again is the metric of how diverse the soundscape is, has these two peaks, one really early in the morning and one during the dusk. If we compare that with conventional forestry, we see that the morning peak is pretty much lost. The dusk peak is a little bit lower. Improved forestry is a little more similar to the never logged forest, but there is still a substantial impact. Now, this is from the dry season. From the rainy season, sadly, we no longer have never logged forests. I will not go to the reasons why. I can go into that in the questions. That never logged forest was no longer never logged, essentially. So as the best, second best control, we're using national parks. Now, national parks in Gabon had been selectively logged 20 years ago. So they had been logged, they're recovering. And when we compare them with conventional forestry, there's actually not that much difference. Even improved forestry is kind of similar. So national parks are essentially retired logging concessions, and that is why I think we are not seeing too much difference during the rainy season. But during the dry season, we do see slightly bigger difference, so we wanted to know what actually causes that difference, right? We have found that actually the logging intensity across these concessions has not varied much at all. Interestingly, improved forestry as well as conventional forestry had very similar volumes of wood being extracted. We also know it's not the time since logging because we controlled for that. What we do know, though, is that the gunshot hunting rates vary quite a lot. So what we found is that the highest gunshot hunting rates were in conventional forestry. In national parks, there are some national parks where there was no hunting, and others where there was a lot of hunting. In improved forestry, there was mostly little hunting. So when we control for everything else, but just look at gunshot rates, and I'll show you the full graph and then I'll take you through it, we see that high gun hunting, which is the darkest purple color, has a significant effect on the soundscape saturation compared to almost no hunting or very low hunting, which is the green line. In improved forestry, we only have 2 low hunting rates to be able to see this effect. And then in conventional forestry, we don't have any areas that have no hunting. That's why some of the lines are missing. But at least in the national parks, we get the full picture. And we get this picture that actually hunting is a really important factor that contributes to good biodiversity outcomes if it's managed properly. And it's actually more important than the amount of habitat destruction from the logging. So to conclude, though, I think the single most important point that I want to repeat 100 times is that even the best forestry, even the lowest impact forestry, still has an effect. And never logged forests still are different. And I think that's really important. We do see that FSC certified or the improved forestry is better than conventional forestry, and that this effect likely actually happens through the mechanism of managing hunting better. And so what are the consequences for conservation then? Do not log never logged forests. There are so few left in the world. I don't believe there is a reason to log them. There's enough forests that have already been logged, so even though we need wood, right, let's not log never logged forests. Let's encourage certification, but let's also, on top of that, or let's emphasize sustainable hunting management within logging, but also elsewhere. And if you're interested in sustainable logging in Gabon, I would highlight a paper by Graydon Fraser from 2022. Okay, so we were not able to answer our question, right? Because we did not have a good enough variation of logging intensities in Gabon. That's why I will very briefly talk about findings from elsewhere. And this time I'll just show you the results. These are results from Tatiana Maeda's PhD, who's a PhD student in my lab. Tatiana used similar techniques, also calculated soundscape saturation, but she worked in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And she found that repeated improved forestry just leads to decreased biodiversity, and that improved forestry happens at higher intensity than conventional forestry. So she found that yes, improved logging actually has bigger impact on biodiversity than conventional logging because of the logging intensity. So this kind of would tell us that for biodiversity, the intensity itself is actually really important. But I should say there's very little to no hunting in her study area. So that effect has been minimized. We also found in Indonesia that the very first time logging has a similar effect on soundscape saturation as very first time logging in Gabon. So we see that the dawn peak in soundscape saturation shifts a little bit to the left, to earlier, and that the dusk peak really decreases. We're now looking into whether this is due to different seasonal effects, seasonal things like bird migrations. And again, we can do that because we can record soundscapes throughout the whole year. Overall, though, in Indonesia, I'd found through various previous projects that actually the difference between improved forestry and conventional forestry sometimes is there, it's not as large, it depends on a lot of other factors. But a really important point is that regardless of what type of forestry we're doing, the biodiversity is still much higher than if we convert the forest to, let's say, a monoculture plantation. So I personally really think improved forestry is important because forestry impacts 2/3 of tropical forests. So even if we can improve by a little bit, it can scale up due to the large area affected. But what is even more important is to make sure that the forest stays standing. And as we found out together with David during the project that we're doing when I was still here, for example, in Indonesia, a lot of logging companies are going out of business. Selective logging is no longer profitable, and a lot of these inactive or out of business concessions actually are starting to have higher deforestation rates than active logging concessions. So when a company goes out of business, all sorts of other things can happen that lead to deforestation. And that's why I think it's really important, again, to look at the big picture. Are we replacing forestry concessions, let's say with monoculture plantations? And that would have huge consequences for biodiversity. And that's why the next example I want to talk about in more detail is about paying from carbon finance to keep forests standing. So this is work led by Sagara, who's a PhD student in my lab, and it concerns our second most important nature-based climate solution. So as you might know, forest carbon prospecting or trying to protect forests through carbon credits and similar schemes is seen as extremely profitable, as demonstrated by our Princeton alum Lian Pinko in his paper from a couple of years ago. And the case I'll talk about is from Sierra Leone and Liberia, which is here on the map. And we picked that case because this Greater Gola landscape, which has implemented a REDD+ project. REDD+ means reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. This case in Greater Gola landscape has been flagged by multiple organizations as like the model natural climate solution case. Okay. So here on this map, we have a national park in Liberia, which will be our kind of control. This national park does not receive any carbon finance, just a national park. Then in Sierra Leone, we have a national park that is also receiving money through REDD+. So that is our intervention or treatment. Then we have a second kind of a control, which is a community forest surrounding the national park in Sierra Leone, where deforestation is allowed for certain purposes like agroforestry and where some hunting is allowed. Okay. So the reason why this setup is really, I think, amazing is because it's so rare to get in conservation a kind of quasi-experimental design possible, because national parks are not allocated randomly, right? It's very hard to do a randomized control trial with national parks and with REDD+. But here we have two national parks that span the same forest type, very similar history, but they differ in whether they're receiving REDD+ payment or not. So that means we can really look at whether, number two, REDD+ leads to an additional biodiversity benefit, or whether we're wasting money because biodiversity would have been protected just by the virtue of having a national park. And before that question, we also want to know whether protecting forests at all results into improved biodiversity, just in case. Okay, so again, I want to highlight that we were only able to do this quite ambitious quasi-experimental design because of the scalability that bioacoustics allows us, right? Sagara would have not been able to go to all of his sites at the same time and be doing point counts or pitfall traps or something like that. So let's look at the results. Again, we're talking about soundscape saturation, so a measure of how diverse is the vocalizing biodiversity. And here we can see the community forests where some deforestation is allowed, has substantially different soundscape profile to the national park in REDD+. We kind of lost a lot of saturation during the day, and that is, to be honest, not unexpected. But is it really because of the national park? Sagar has been able to do a regression discontinuity design where, and I'll take you through this somewhat complicated graph, where we have the national park border right at 0, so it's the dotted line. If you go right, you're going deeper and deeper into the national park. If you go left, you're going further and further away from the national park. So one of these bands is 1 day, okay, 1 daily soundscape profile. And you can see that there is a large discontinuity right at the park border. And even if we just consider, let's say, the dawn, which is super important for vocalizing biodiversity, we see a large discontinuity. Okay, so yes, protecting the forest with National Park and REDD+ does lead to good outcomes. But what about the REDD+ being really good or just an additional waste of money? So here are the results for the National Park in Liberia, which is in gray, and our National Park in REDD+. And we can see those two soundscape profiles are much more similar to each other. But there is a significant difference right before the dawn and then during midday, where REDD+ does seem to be bringing an additional benefit to biodiversity. Sagar is now working on figuring out exactly what is the mechanism. He's using also eDNA data and species level analyses, and the first take is that it's also due to hunting. Interesting. REDD+ allows money for alternative livelihoods for potential hunters, and it also allows for increased patrols. Okay, so we answered yes to both of these questions. And to conclude, I'll just briefly mention that I've also done work on reforestation, which is the #1 nature-based climate solution. And I won't talk about it today because it's a publication that's already come out, and it's exceptional that even the economists would write about biodiversity, so I'll let you read that if you're interested. Instead, I want to conclude with a few general thoughts. So I've shown you how nature-based climate solutions have been good for biodiversity in Sierra Leone and even in Gabon, but by no means can I conclude that this is true in general for nature-based climate solutions. These were kind of the best case scenarios, and there are reasons why we picked them. They're really well run with good NGOs. But we cannot generalize because nature-based climate solutions have been scaled up so much that we cannot say that all REDD+ is good. Instead, what I want to emphasize is we can use new technology like bioacoustics to monitor on a case-by-case basis, so that we keep accountable the individual actors that are doing the nature-based climate solutions. And with bioacoustics or other techniques, we can now finally move towards also causal inference in biodiversity studies, which probably you are used to from other disciplines that are pretty common, but in biodiversity, there are not many studies that can really prove this intervention caused this outcome rather than it was just correlated. What I also think is that bioacoustics can be a good tool for accountability from people who actually live in the forest. So there have been cases of nature-based climate solutions that have just not worked and that have resulted in taking away rights from indigenous populations for worse biodiversity outcomes. And I think that bioacoustics can be used by communities who are in those forests to record the gunshots they hear, to record the new chainsaws, to record that their never logged forest is now logged in Gabon, and to really show to the world if things are not going well. I think that's important. So yes, we want companies and NGOs to keep themselves accountable, to have to do all the reporting, but we also want to, for people who live in the forest to have power to keep those big organizations accountable. And finally, and I've not talked about this at all today, but soundscapes hold a huge potential for ecological insights and discoveries. The data is so rich. I mean, where else do we have detailed ecological data for years at a time on many different organisms? And I think this opens up potential for even new questions to be asked. And I also want to use this to highlight one more time that let's preserve those types of habitats that have never been logged so that we can keep the potential for this new discovery. And with that, I would like to thank all of our funders and collaborators beyond the lab as well as lab members, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Zuzana. Terrific. Are there questions from the audience?
Thank you for this great talk. So often in biodiversity metrics, species aren't considered equal. They're like indicator species or extinction risk is factored in. I'm wondering if you could speak to the extent to which your sound saturation curve can kind of deal with those quantities.
Mm-hmm. So the soundscape saturation ignores those different importances we might give to species. So it gives species kind of an equal opportunity, and that is why it's one of the few metrics where insects count, and frogs, as well as mammals and birds. It's not a perfect metric that it doesn't give each species exactly the same contribution, but it at least broadens the number of species we consider. For those projects that do need to consider keystone species or species of particular conservation concern, then it's much better to use machine learning algorithm to tease those signatures out. And I think that's often the kind of general framework we think of. We want to look at broad differences and complement that with individual species approaches. Yeah. So it's a question in the back. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. This is super fascinating. I just had a question about how particularly promising are resources in tropical contexts with other ecosystems, and of course, like not all, I mean, not all animals make enough noise to be affected. So, like, how much might this like be particularly good for this and not good for others? Like, what's the
Yes. So you're absolutely right that this is great for highly biodiverse, low visibility habitats like tropical forests. It's less good for open habitats that are really windy, like grasslands, prairies, deserts, because the wind affects our soundscapes. It is increasingly also used in freshwater and marine soundscapes, even though marine acoustics has a long, long history of whale and dolphin recordings. Only in the recent years, people have been actually looking at soundscapes, like coral reef soundscapes and such. So it's definitely not kind of one solution for all biodiversity measurement problems, because plants don't make sound, right? And lots of animals don't make sounds. But what I see increasingly as this trio of bioacoustics, camera traps, and environmental DNA, together with some remote sensing, is kind of the sweet spot of complementarity of techniques. I mean, if NGOs can afford all three techniques, excellent. But I think that, yeah, not relying on one technique is definitely smart. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. This was an awesome talk. I'm just curious, could you say more about how the soundscape saturation is defined?
Yes.
Since the relative quantity, it's not clear to me what 100% is.
Yes, yes. So the way it's defined is that, first of all, we take the soundscape. I'll just talk about 1 minute for now. We divide the 1 minute into 256 frequency bins from 0 kilohertz to 22 kilohertz. And we look whether in each of the bins, acoustic power, basically number of decibels, has exceeded a certain threshold. And that threshold is key to what would 100% be. The way we've been selecting the threshold is to basically achieve a roughly normal distribution of soundscape saturation for intact forest, basically. So we always make sure that the threshold is the same for the whole project or whole country, but it may be different in a forest in Wisconsin, where there are very few vocalizations compared to forests in Papua New Guinea. So yes, it's a relative measure, and it is not the only acoustic index out there. There's actually like 63 of them, and different indices are good for different things. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Yeah.
I guess it depends on the intensity, but what's the radius of cover?
Mm-hmm. So that doesn't depend as much on the index, but on your equipment. So depending on the type of microphone you might have, and also you can play with a setting called gain, which means that you might be hearing really far or really close. But in a dense tropical forest, the very rough metric might be for small songbirds, it might be 50-meter radius. But for orangutan or chimpanzees, you might hear them up to 1 kilometer. So it's tricky because we have these kind of variable detection spaces depending on the species. And that's why calculating things like species abundance is tricky. We can do species presence and absence, but abundance becomes very hard for that reason. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks for the really inspiring talk. So I assume that you have been doing this for a long time, so do you see any long-term trends that can be monitored using this method in terms of how biodiversity is as far as regenerates or continues to get lost?
So I've been doing this since about 2015, but not at the same places. So I personally have not recorded for more than 2 years at one place, but other researchers have. Maybe the most famous example is by Bernie Krause, who you might know, who's recorded for decades at the same places, and he is saying there's always degradation and loss of the soundscape. But for example, in our work in Ecuador, we used kind of space for time substitution, and with reforestation there were improvements in the soundscape. But I think for those really long-term studies, we still have to wait a little more. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Great work, and thank you for doing what you're doing. I have 2 questions. One is, I know perhaps it's unrelated directly to your presentation, but it has to do with the areas that have most of the tropical forests are developing countries. Have you seen that in the field of deforestation, are carbon credits working to keep the countries from deforesting? I mean, is that happening, or is it all a thought, a theory up there and not really helping?
Mm-hmm.
And second, have you developed like an app that we can follow your sound somewhere?
Great questions, thank you. For the first one, I have seen examples where carbon credits have worked, like in Sierra Leone, in this RED Plus project. But I'm really hesitant to say that they work overall. I'm not an expert on this, but what I am seeing and from other studies and hearing is that it's really hard to make them work well, and it's extremely controversial. And it's hard to conclude, yes, that's the way to go. So I'm extremely cautious about carbon credits. For the second question, I don't have an app yet, but we're launching a website which is called the Soundscape Baseline Project website, which has recordings from the most intact forests around the world, where we're working with local partners, indigenous communities, and local researchers to record at least 1 year of soundscapes from these different spots. And those all data will be available, so if you want to fall asleep to the rainforest sounds, it will be available, yeah. Yes?
Thanks so much. This is super interesting. I wanted to ask, one of your future directions, you wanted to speak a little bit more to like the causality. And for example, we said hunting might be like one of the main mechanisms, but I can also think like just people moving about is probably really correlated with hunting. So maybe it's not the actual hunting as the direct mechanism, but just increased human activity. So I was wondering if you had some thoughts about where you might go with trying to get towards some of these causal and types of relationships.
Yeah, I think being able to show causality is definitely a big direction, and I want to keep pursuing that. In terms of hunting, first of all, I don't think hunting is a bad thing. For example, in Gabon, hunting is a fundamental part of life for many people, and so it's not about, and they've been doing it for really, really long time. And so it's not about like, oh, there are more and more people in the forest or something like that. It's just about figuring out what works for those local communities, how can they manage their hunting areas sustainably. I don't think it's necessarily the human presence that would cause these big dips in the soundscapes. I think it's the actual hunting itself and then kind of cascading effects on other species.
Yeah, I guess you can just see a lot of animals being quiet if there's a bunch of people around.
Yes, yeah. Yes, and I think that's for sure a phenomenon, right? Like, yeah, if you walk into the forest, many species will either do alarm calls or they will be quiet. And I think that effect is small compared to animals missing entirely. Yeah. But being able to show that is something they'll be interested in. Can we really prove that it's the lack of animals rather than their changes in behavior? And that's something that I think combining this with the environmental DNA data will allow us to do, because then we can see actual changes in abundance. But it's a good question.
Zuzana, thank you so much for a really interesting and exciting talk.